Hey friend, welcome back to the YouTube channel for the Renaissance English History Podcast. I am your host, Heather. I've been podcasting on Tudor England since 2009 with my show, which makes it the original Tudor History Podcast. This channel is where I put all of my episodes from all of my shows, as well as lots of extra content like this video right here. So today we're going to talk about some of Henry VIII's most brutal executions / punishments, because I count Wolsey in this list as well, because then we're going to talk about whether Henry ever regretted some of these downfalls, because evidence shows that he might have regretted some of them, but of course he never actually blamed himself. He blamed other people for what happened, said that he'd been given bad advice, etc., etc. So we're going to look at 4 of the most kind of brutal executions, the ones that are really the stains on Henry, I suppose. I mean, there's a lot of them, but we're going to pick 4. And like I said, I'm counting Wolsey as one of them, just because his downfall, he'd been so loyal and his downfall was so swift. And even though he wasn't executed, he probably would have been if he had survived and been tried. And then we're going to talk about whether Henry ever regretted them. So let's get into it. Before we do, just a reminder that if you are not already subscribed to this channel and you want to see more Tudor history in your YouTube feed, who doesn't? Go ahead and hit subscribe so you never miss a video that we put out. All right, so Henry VIII's reign is remembered as a bloody one, heads rolled at an alarming pace, and few, even among his closest friends and advisors, were truly safe. But once the dust settled and the scaffolds were cleared, did Henry ever regret the brutal falls that he orchestrated? Was there ever even a glimmer of remorse behind the crown? Today we're going to talk about the aftermath of some of Henry's most shocking betrayals, the downfall of his second queen, Anne Boleyn, the execution of his right-hand man, Thomas Cromwell, the long fall of Cardinal Wolsey, and the horrifying death of Margaret Pole, an elderly noblewoman whose execution shocked even the most hardened courtiers. So let's start with Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was the woman for whom Henry had broken England apart, the dazzling queen who had once been the center of his universe. But by 1536, she was fighting for her life against a tide of false accusations, adultery, incest, and treason. Her trial was a farce, her execution swift. In the immediate aftermath, Henry wasted no time mourning. Just days after Anne's death, he was seen parading on the Thames in a barge, openly celebrating with the ladies of the court. Preparations for his marriage to Jane Seymour were underway almost before Anne's body had cooled. Outwardly, it looked like Henry had simply brushed her aside without a second thought. But there are hints that her death left a deeper mark. His moods reportedly grew darker over the summer. Courtiers noticed an increasing irritability and a hardening of his already suspicious nature. He rarely spoke of Anne, and when he did, it was to blame her for her own downfall. If there was any regret there, it wasn't the kind that softened him. It was the kind that twisted itself into bitterness and paranoia. What about Thomas Cromwell? Well, when Henry broke apart the old England, Cromwell had been Henry's architect, the man who helped to build the new England out of the rubble of the old one. For years, Cromwell had been indispensable, clearing the way for Henry's ambitions through diplomacy, legislation, and, when necessary, a few carefully arranged executions. It was Cromwell who had overseen Anne's downfall, and yet, just 4 years later, Cromwell himself would fall victim to the same brutal machinery. Cromwell's biggest mistake was arranging Henry's disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, a political match that Henry found personally unbearable. Enemies at court seized on the opportunity, and Cromwell was arrested, imprisoned, and executed within months. Now, in this case, there actually is strong evidence that Henry did regret what he had done. The Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, had reported that Henry called Cromwell the most faithful servant he ever had. He blamed others, especially the Duke of Norfolk and Stephen Gardiner, for poisoning his mind against Cromwell. Afterwards, Henry reportedly ordered Cromwell's portrait hidden away because he couldn't bear to look at it. It's one of the few instances where Henry's guilt seems to have broken through his usual justifications. But as always with Henry, the realization came too late to save anyone. Now let's talk about Cardinal Wolsey. Long before Anne Boleyn or Thomas Cromwell, there was Thomas Wolsey, the brilliant, ambitious cleric who had served as Henry's chief minister for nearly 2 decades. Wolsey had shaped Henry's early reign, securing alliances, negotiating treaties, managing the court. But when he failed to deliver the king's annulment from Catherine of Aragon, his enemies closed in. In 1529, Wolsey was stripped of his office and his titles. 2 years later, summoned to London to face charges of treason. He died on the road at Leicester Abbey, likely of illness. But few doubted that had he actually made it to London, the block would have awaited him. Henry's reaction to Wolsey's death was complex. On one hand, he raged against Wolsey's betrayal. On the other, he was reportedly somber at the news, musing that Wolsey had served him well until he didn't. If Henry felt regret here, it seems to have been brief, swallowed up quickly by the narrative that Wolsey had simply failed him. Finally, the most brutal execution of them all was Margaret Pole. Few executions during Henry's reign were as shocking or grotesque as that of Margaret Pole. She was the Countess of Salisbury in her own right. She was a niece of Edward IV, so Margaret carried royal blood, making her a permanent thorn in Henry's side as he grew more paranoid about the threats to his dynasty. In 1541, after years of tenuous imprisonment in the Tower, she was abruptly sentenced to death without a formal trial. Her execution was a horror. The inexperienced headsman missed the mark repeatedly, hacking her to death in a gruesome, drawn-out scene that horrified witnesses. She also actually apparently tried to run away, saying that she wasn't going to just put her head on the block, and so he was like chasing her, and she was in her 60s at this point. It was just not a good scene. Now, there's no record that Henry expressed any regret over Margaret's death, and in fact, it's unclear that he ever dwelled on it. Foreign observers, however, were appalled, and Margaret's execution darkened Henry's reputation across Europe. If he ever had any second thoughts, they never made it into the historical record. More likely, by this stage of his reign, he was too far gone, isolated, suspicious, and convinced that bloodshed was the only sure path to security. And speaking of executions that shocked Europe, I'm going to throw in an extra one here, Thomas More. Thomas More wasn't just Henry's Lord Chancellor. He had once been a beloved courtier. He was an intellectual companion. He was a trusted friend, almost a father figure. Early in his reign, More had helped to nurture the king's humanist image. He encouraged him in his studies. He praised his mind. Their relationship was deeply personal, which made More's refusal to accept Henry's supremacy over the church all the more painful. More's execution in 1535 was carefully staged. He was charged with treason for his silence, not for any public rebellion, and he was beheaded at the Tower. His final words were a masterclass in quiet defiance. He died, he said, the king's good servant, but God's first. As for Henry, there's little evidence that he openly regretted More's death. If anything, he seemed to have convinced himself that More's stubbornness had left him no choice. But the shadow of More's martyrdom lingered, and abroad, Henry's reputation suffered badly. If Henry ever felt any private sorrow for sending an old friend to the scaffold, he kept it buried deep. Another hard scar on a reign increasingly defined by the blood of the once beloved. So, did Henry ever regret any of the blood on his hands? In Thomas Cromwell's case, this is unique because he almost certainly did with Cromwell, but it was too late to undo it. With Anne Boleyn and Cardinal Wolsey, maybe a passing shadow of regret, but it quickly hardened into blame or bitterness. With Margaret Pole, there's not a shred of evidence that he felt anything at all. And with Thomas More, he seemed to justify the whole thing and say Thomas More brought it on himself. So if Henry ever regretted anything, it wasn't the cruelty. It was losing the people who once served his ambitions and losing pieces of himself along the way. So there we go, a little thought about some of the worst downfalls and whether Henry ever regretted them, which it's interesting that with Cromwell he did. And the other ones, not so much. So if you made it to this point in the video and you enjoyed it, I sure would appreciate a press that like button. It beats that algorithm and gets our content to even more people. And I hope I earned your subscription to my channel if I don't already have it, or I put out videos like this on the regular. If you want to keep binging Tudor content, here's a video I did on Henry VIII's inner circle, his closest friends and early companions. You might enjoy that. Here's a video that YouTube thinks you'll like. All right, I will be back very soon. Remember, you are deeply loved. I am so glad I share this planet with you. I will talk to you soon. Thanks so much for being here. And don't forget to drink your water, friends. All right. Bye-bye.